And now for tonight's speaker. And I want to begin my introduction of Suzanne for thanking Suzanne for all of her service to Drayton Hall. Suzanne has been working with our curatorial staff and Sarah Stroud for the last number of years, working to research Drayton Hall's collection, but then also bringing it to the public at Colonial Williamsburg in the relatively new, rich and varied culture that runs through 2019. The work, though, and the collaboration has continued beyond the scope of that exhibit, and just today and yesterday, Suzanne and Sarah have been collaborating, learning more about our collection and what it means about Drayton Hall. You probably saw, or hope that you saw, Sarah's pop-up exhibit out in the lobby, side room here. Just a small sampling of our archaeological collection, which totals over 1 million artifacts. And part of the vision that we're working on is the creation of facilities that we can connect the visiting public to both the archaeological collection, but then the decorative arts collection as well. So tonight, it's my honor to introduce Susan Fidlin Hood, the Curator of Ceramics and Glass at Colonial Williamsburg. Ms. Hood holds a BA in History from Wheaton College in Massachusetts and a Master's from the Winter Program in Early American Culture in the University of Delaware. Prior to Suzanne's arrival at Colonial Williamsburg in 2002, she was employed at the Chipstone Foundation in Milwaukee, Wisconsin. Her research focuses on ceramics owned and used in 17th and 18th century America, with a particular emphasis on archaeological ceramics, Chinese export porcelain, salt glazed stoneware, and British pottery. Ms. Hood is co-author with Janine Scarry of Salt Glazed Stoneware in Early America, winner of the American Ceramic Circle Book Award for 2009. Her most recent exhibition, China of the Most Fashionable Sort, Chinese Export Porcelain in Colonial America, is currently on view at the DeWitt Wallace Decorative Arts Museum in Colonial Williamsburg, and I encourage you all to visit. So I hope you'll please join me in welcoming Suzanne. We're in for a treat.
I was going to just throw the pages off the podium as I finish them, but I think I'm going to try to put them very demurely here. But thank you all so much, and thanks to Carter and Sarah and everyone from Drayton Hall who brought me here and has spent time with me. I've had so much fun. If you haven't been to play with the broken stuff at Drayton Hall, I highly recommend it. It is so much fun. There's just treasures upon treasures. So I love this stuff, and I'm really happy that I get to be here to share it with you. So before I begin, I'm going to just say that every object that you're going to be seeing this evening either has an American history of ownership that goes back to the 18th century or was archaeologically recovered in America or matches archaeological fragments. And that's the wonderful thing about ceramics. They were always made in multiples. So there's always another one out there, almost always. So if you find it in the ground, you can often go and acquire an intact object, which is how we furnish the museum at Colonial Williamsburg and the historic area, and I know that that's something that's important at Drayton Hall as well. So it's always fun that there's more than one out there. In December of 1762, Robert Beverley of Blandfield Plantation in Essex County, Virginia, wrote to his factor, John Bland, in London. In that letter, he asked Bland to purchase a number of items on his behalf, including a complete set of china, the dishes to be oval, the whole to be sufficient for 2 genteel courses of victuals, 2 larger tureens, and 2 very small ditto, breakfast plates, teacups, coffee cups, and all necessary appendages for a handsome tea table. I hope you will be kind enough to choose china of the most fashionable sort, for in all human probability I shall spend my life in this colony. I shall always desire to make it as commodious as the place will admit of, as Providence has been so good as to fix me in affluent circumstances. This letter contains a lot of information about the choices Beverley made, and in this case, we can use Beverley as a stand-in for a larger group of people. This group of planters were large landowners in rural 18th century Virginia. They were very affluent. They aspired to create a comfortable and fashionable life, and Chinese porcelain was one aspect of this construction. This is how I approach the study of porcelain and ceramics in general. My research focuses primarily on the consumption and use rather than the production of them. This methodology means that place is essential to my understanding of ceramics, as well as their functions, how these things were used, which objects were chosen, treasured, and passed on, and which were discarded and forgotten. Not that privies aren't the best things ever, because they are. Today, we will examine Chinese porcelain through the lenses of place and time. We will visit the world of colonial America, spending most of our time in Williamsburg and touching on some other southern colonies. And we will do this primarily through an examination of the archaeological record with support from newspaper advertisements, probate inventories, and other historical documents. So let us return to Robert Beverly and his home on the Rappahannock River in Tidewater, Virginia. Beverly only loosely specifies the number of objects that he would like to purchase, the whole to be sufficient for 2 genteel courses of victuals, suggesting that he and John Bland share an understanding of what is required for stylish dining. He stipulates form and that fashion is important to him. He would like his tea table to be handsome and the china to be of the most fashionable sort, but he does not specify color, style, or a specific pattern. Does this mean that he believed that Bland's choices would be satisfactory because they had worked together for some time, or were these details that mean so much to many of us of lesser importance to him? My research suggests that it may have been a combination of the two, but I lean more towards the latter because of one very significant factor. I have yet to find in a colonial newspaper a single advertisement for Chinese porcelain in which a particular pattern or decorative scheme is identified. Not one. Color is occasionally referenced, blue and white, red and white, or burnt, but there are no mentions of birds, landscapes, or figures. The act of owning the porcelain appears to have been more important than what it looked like, and it seems that almost everyone in colonial America wanted to own porcelain, if at all possible. Chinese porcelain played a role in the lives of English colonists from the very beginning. In 1607, when the English landed at Jamestown and established the first permanent English settlement in North America, Chinese porcelain was already well integrated into European culture. In fact, although early settlers carried few personal possessions, at least one of them brought Chinese porcelain to Jamestown in the form of a small wine cup. Colonists who came to Virginia and other parts of North America were no different from their European brethren. They were fascinated with porcelain. And as Bly Strobe has indicated, it was like they were going to the moon. And they chose to bring Chinese porcelain with them. They were living in holes in the ground. I'm not kidding. They dug holes in the ground, tarps over their heads, they're wearing ruffed collars, and they have porcelain. Talk about insane, but anyway. Most of the archaeological objects that I'm going to show today were excavated in Williamsburg. So before we proceed, let me give you a bit of background on Williamsburg for some of you who might be not quite as familiar with it. This is a map of the historic area of Williamsburg. Settlement patterns in the southern colonies, as you all know, tended to be different from those in the North and Mid-Atlantic. Most of the economy was centered on agriculture, and the rural plantation system was established early on. Towns and cities were smaller than their more northern counterparts, with a few exceptions, and we are in one of those exceptions at the moment. But most of those exceptions also tended to be seats of government. Williamsburg was founded officially as a city in 1699, although certainly there were people living there prior to its official incorporation. And when the capital was moved from Jamestown to Williamsburg in 1699, it remained there until the Revolution, at which point it was moved to Richmond. So Williamsburg was an important town in the 18th century. Smaller, certainly, than Charleston, Boston, or New York, but still thriving with many wealthy inhabitants. Given its cultural importance, it isn't surprising that by the middle of the 18th century, most people living in Williamsburg owned at least 1 or 2 pieces of Chinese export porcelain. Chinese porcelain constitutes one of the largest groups of artifacts recovered from archaeological sites in Tidewater, Virginia. Through it, 18th century Virginians expressed their growing affluence and participated in the larger consumer world. Of the porcelain sherds recovered archaeologically and the china listed on household inventories, the overwhelming majority of vessels were related to the drinking of tea, coffee, or chocolate, but most were related to tea. This teacup and saucers were excavated from a circa 1745 context at the site of a coffee house in Williamsburg. When buying into the world of porcelain, colonists purchased teacups and saucers first. Today, we tend to think of teawares in sets, and although they could be acquired that way, doing so was not common. In the 1757 York County Inventory of Sarah Green's household goods listed sundry old china cups and saucers, but no other ceramic teawares. She was serving her tea from a silver teapot, which was also listed on her inventory. George Wells's 1754 inventory included 6 china cups and saucers, and his teapot was pewter. Most of the archaeological sites where porcelain cups and saucers were excavated did not yield porcelain teapots. In 1769, Sarah Pitt, a shopkeeper in Williamsburg, advertised in the Virginia Gazette. She noted a large assortment of millinery goods for sale, including combs, bonnets, and satin pumps, as well as china teacups, coffee cups, and saucers. These last items were the only ceramics Sarah Pitt offered. No teapots, no sugar bowls, no cream jugs. After the beverage-related porcelains, plates were the most common Chinese porcelain objects owned in colonial Virginia. Hollow wares such as soup tureens, vases, and coffee pots were much less common. While the variety of vessel types was fairly limited, a great deal of diversity existed in decoration. Unlike other imported ceramics owned in colonial America, Chinese porcelain was not only more expensive to purchase, but it also seems to have been the only ceramic type to retain a status beyond its intrinsic value. It was routinely advertised for sale in household auctions, along with silver, furniture, land, and slaves. Public auctions of household goods and property were held fairly often. Most frequently, they were used to dispose of the estate of a deceased person, such as the auction in 1767 at the seat of the late Philip Ludwell, where his household furniture, consisting of beds and furniture thereto belonging, mahogany and black walnut furniture for halls and bedchambers, mostly new and finished in the most elegant manner, were sold along with a parcel of china. Debt was another common reason the entire household was sold. In 1768, Thomas Boswell advertised in the Virginia Gazette, "Finding it impossible to do justice to his creditors without disposing of his estate, and very difficult to sell it for near its value, intends to dispose of the same by way of lottery. To consist of 292 acres of land in the county of Gloucester and the parish of Kingston, known by the name of Marlows, about a mile from the Piankatank. Along with the land, 14 slaves were listed by name, age, and gender, followed by 2 separate entries for 6 china dishes and a dozen of plates." So it appears as 6 china dishes and a dozen of plates, 6 china dishes and a dozen of plates, immediately one following the other, as well as another entry for 4 china dishes. And that description suggests that Thomas Boswell had Chinese export porcelain in 3 patterns. Otherwise, it would be lumped all together, not listed out in 3 things. So I'm grateful that he was going bankrupt, because now we know he owned 3 different sets of china. Death and debt were 2 of the most common causes for households to be liquidated, but sometimes the reason was less distressing. In 1777, John Baker advertised that he was selling his home and furnishings because he was moving to another part of the country. Baker, an Englishman by birth, was the first medically trained dentist to practice in colonial America. He taught Paul Revere how to fashion dentures prior to moving to Virginia, where he fabricated a partial denture for George Washington. In 1777, he was ready to move on from Williamsburg, having dealt with the most important teeth in the colony, and he advertised the sale of his home and the furnishings in the Virginia Gazette. The ad suggests that dentistry was a very lucrative profession in the 18th century because, in addition to a lengthy list of elaborate furniture, he also owned tea and table china, bowls, and ornamental china. Ornamental china is something of particular interest to me because we find so little evidence for it archaeologically. As objects with no inherent function beyond being beautiful, ornamental china represented the height of luxury. Its relative scarcity in the archaeological record, coupled with the enduring idea that the southern colonies were unfashionable backwaters, has led many of us to assume that there were few examples of garnitures or figures owned in the South during the 18th century. Except in Charleston, of course. However, an examination of inventories and a closer look at some archaeology has led to a better understanding of what was actually here, and perhaps the most elaborate example of this is the case of John Randolph. Randolph was born in Williamsburg, educated in London, and then he returned to Virginia in 1749, where he practiced law and amassed quite a fortune. In 1775, John Randolph decided to leave Williamsburg for England because his loyalist politics were at odds with most of his fellow Virginians. When he left, he signed over his large estate to his brother Peyton Randolph. This detailed document listed real estate including Randolph's home near the center of town, which you see in a line drawing here, slaves, and household furniture. He owned a large amount of Chinese porcelain, including 2 handsome ornamental china branches, 5 flower pots, and 6 small china figures on the chimneypiece in the drawing room. And in the dining parlor, 1 pair ornamental china branches, 7 pieces ornamental china. So this list reveals that John Randolph owned 2 pairs of porcelain candlesticks, 1 or perhaps 2 garnitures and figures, as well as more functional items, which he listed separately, such as soup tureens and punch bowls. And he left all of them behind in Williamsburg in 1775. Unfortunately, I don't know where any of them are. It's very sad. Much like the last governor of Virginia, the Earl of Murray, Lord Dunmore, although Dunmore left much more suddenly and was not without nearly as much planning as Randolph. He left in the middle of the night, as you may recall. He picked up and fled and left behind the governor's palace and many of his household goods, including his armorial china. So for those of you that love armorial china, this is it. This is the sole piece of armorial we're going to talk about tonight. When Lord Dunmore moved to Virginia, he brought this service with him where it was used at the governor's palace. This is the only example of an armorial service that has a history of use in pre-revolutionary Williamsburg. Pieces of the service have been recovered archaeologically at several sites in Williamsburg, including the palace. Sadly, the only known intact example from this service was sold in the 1960s in England and has not surfaced since. Not surprisingly, the governor's palace is another home in Virginia where a great deal of elaborate Chinese porcelain was owned. Extensive archaeological excavation of the site has yielded a wide array of unusual items that can be linked, in some cases, to ownership by a particular governor. This teacup, one of a pair recovered from the site, was likely owned by Lieutenant Governor Alexander Spotswood, who served in Virginia from 1710 until 1722. These teacups are ornamented over the exterior surface with a simplified version of the Sanskrit character Om, which also appears on the bottom of the interior. Sanskrit, a liturgical language used in Hinduism and Buddhism, appears on a number of Chinese porcelains in Southeast Asia and India. The design can be read like a prayer wheel. As the bowl is rotated, the prayer is released. So that's Om repeated over and over and over on that cup, and as you turn it, as you're drinking from it, it sends that prayer into the universe. I like to think that Governor Spotswood was inadvertently, I don't think he was practicing yoga, but he was sending this prayer out there. Despite their apparent lack of connection to a Western audience, sherds decorated with this same pattern have been excavated from 2 additional sites in Virginia, Jamestown Island and Bacon's Castle in Surrey, as well as from a 16th century Spanish colonial settlement on Paris Island, and from a site just a few minutes from here that you all saw pieces of out in the, whatever we're calling that room out there. The 2 cups found in Williamsburg were used in the same location at the same time. That's important. Same location, same time. But as you can see from the foot rings on these 2 cups, okay? One of them has been completely trimmed and finished, the one on the left. The one on the right has not. So that's as it would have come off the wheel after it was formed, not finished, not that wonderful trimming down that we expect to find on the bottom of a teacup. And yet, clearly, they were both sold, both used at the same place, but at the same time, so people had different expectations of what matching and finish was about, because this proves it. This isn't a second. This was used at the governor's palace. Widely different idea from what we would think of as being finished. These two dishes, decorated with the lotus plant, were also excavated from the site of the governor's palace. They were most likely owned by Francis Fauquier, who served as lieutenant governor of Virginia from 1758 until 1768. One of the things that happens to porcelain decorated with opaque enamels when it's buried is that some colors are changed dramatically by the soils that cover them. And this is the case with these pieces. They would originally have looked like this. Unfortunately, not with this central medallion. The central medallion would have looked like the center of this plate. And I can't find a lotus dish today on the market that has the landscape design in the center with the lotus decoration on the border. If you have one at home, please let me know. I've been looking for 6 years now. So it would be really nice to locate one. But yeah, these are just fabulous. That really rich, wonderful pink is, it's great, but you know, you can't really tell that when you just see them as they were when they came out of the ground. Francis Fauquier died in Williamsburg in 1768, and his elaborate estate included detailed references to porcelain, including 13 enameled china dishes, 2 large round china dishes, 6 china salts, 16 pieces ornamental china, 24 ditto for cabinets, 6 china jars, 28 pieces ribbed china, 10 pieces white china, 34 pieces colored china, and 1 brown china teapot. So he had ornamental china, he had china for dining, he had china in multiple colors, enamel colors, he had china that would have gone on mantelpieces and also in cabinets, he had polychrome enamel, multiple color pieces, and he had molded pieces with ribs, and then he had one wonderful Batavia brown teapot, brown china teapot. So quite an assortment. Wealthy government officials like Alexander Spotswood, Francis Fauquier, and Lord Dunmore, as well as Southern landowners like John Randolph and Robert Beverley, purchased most of their goods directly from England. They had relationships with factors, essentially personal shoppers in England, who acquired wares for them and shipped them to Virginia. The evidence suggests that a limited number of patterns were shipped to fulfill these orders. Therefore, George Washington's order in 1757 for fine image china is similar to the archaeologically recovered tea wares from the Williamsburg's governor's palace that were likely owned by Francis Fauquier. And those fragments are strikingly similar to shards found at another house site in Williamsburg, the Everard House. Variations on the so-called tobacco leaf pattern is another example of the popularity of certain designs in colonial America. This fragment also comes from the governor's palace site. And the pattern on the shard is very similar to this dish. Many collectors still refer to this pattern as tobacco leaf or pseudo-tobacco leaf. I implore you, please never, ever, ever, ever call it that. It has nothing to do with tobacco at all. It never did. In the 20th century, we just made that up. So the foliage on these things actually has more to do with the foliage coming out of Southeast Asia or perhaps the Pacific Islands, and as reflected on textiles being made in India and other places in Asia. The flowers are a cross between a hibiscus and a passion flower, and the wheel-like image on this dish represents the cross-section of a pomegranate. And as you all know, variations on this pattern were also owned by the Hayward family of here in Charleston. Also owned by the Lloyd family of Maryland and the Washingtons at Mount Vernon. A dinner service and punch bowl in this pattern were owned by Mrs. Daniel Parke Custis and brought with her to Mount Vernon when she married George Washington. This portrait by Charles Bridges depicts John Custis IV, a wealthy Virginia landowner who is remembered for his knowledge of botany and expansive gardens, as well as for being the father of Daniel Parke Custis, Martha Dandridge Custis, Washington's first husband. When I moved to Virginia, I have to say, it took me a long while to get used to everyone having at least 6 last names. It was like, I'm from New England, one name. When John Custis died in 1749, he left an extensive estate, including a large home in Williamsburg, as well as his family seat in Accomack County on Virginia's eastern shore. His probate inventory lists a number of impressive Chinese porcelains, including 1 set gilt china, china plates and dishes, china teacups, and 8 china bowls. John Custis was typical of wealthy landowners in Virginia in that he owned Chinese porcelain for use in serving a meal, consuming tea, and having punch. Additionally, archaeological exploration of the site where his Williamsburg home once stood turned up some interesting pieces, including this teacup, and I'm showing you 2 views of the same cup here. The scene is hard to interpret because of its fragmentary nature, but the water buffalo is standing next to a figure that is wading in the water, and there is another figure on the reverse who's holding a fishing pole with a fish on the line. And the teacup may be related to this saucer and a number of other saucers found at the Custis site as well. The images here show figures in a watery landscape with fishing poles. Although Custis's inventory lists bowls, there were no punch bowls excavated, but there were blue and white plates and dishes decorated with fairly standard floral designs. This dish is similar to John Custis's wares in that it features figures in a sparse landscape. Like the so-called tobacco leaf dinner service we discussed, it too was originally owned by John Custis's son, Daniel Parke Custis, and his wife, Martha. It was then brought to Mount Vernon by Martha when she married George Washington. The scene shown here is from the Romance of the Three Kingdoms, a Chinese literary source. The image on this plate, excavated in Williamsburg, was also likely taken from a literary source, in this case from a woodblock illustration of a 13th century Chinese opera called Romance of the Western Chamber. During the 17th century, this story achieved extraordinary popularity both on stage and in print. A number of porcelain objects were decorated with images from the opera, including this similarly decorated example. It is unlikely that anyone in Williamsburg knew this story, but images of this type were very popular on porcelain made for the Chinese market, and we certainly know that they were fashionable in Europe as well. And I think it's always interesting because these images are often very hard for a Western eye to look at and understand, and when I first saw this piece, I didn't have any idea what I was looking at. I also think it's funny that they put this particular story on porcelain. This is the story about a scholar who falls in love with a woman who is unsuitable. And this is the scholar here, and he's brooding. He's sitting in his chamber and he's sulking because the woman's family won't let him marry her. And so he's gone off and gotten very, very drunk and had to be dragged home by servants. And now he's suffering the consequences of that. And eventually he and the lady run off, and then she dies, and it's all very sad and horrible. But again, I'm sure that the people in Williamsburg didn't know that that's what they were eating off of. Most of the designs on Chinese export porcelain had a meaning to either a domestic audience, as well as was the case on the plate we just saw, or a different export market like the cups ornamented with Sanskrit. Like coats of arms or stained glass windows in European cathedrals, decoration on Chinese porcelain had deeper significance, which was understood by the original audience for which it was intended. To colonial consumers, these dishes were attractive, fashionable, and expensive. They indicated wealth and status, but I doubt they saw any deeper meaning. Take the decoration on these dishes, for example, and we know this pattern was very well represented in colonial America. This fragmentary soup plate was originally owned by the Lee family of Stratford Hall in Westmoreland County, Virginia. Stratford was built in the late 1730s, and the dish was found, this is my favorite, this dish was found archaeologically in a rat's nest in the wall of the house. during a 20th century restoration. Rats are awesome. They take the best stuff and they put it all together. And because it wasn't buried, the enamel colors are still really, really bright. Oh, I'll go back. See, if this had been buried in the ground, it would have been, to have the same thing that happened to the lotus dish would have happened to this probably. But because it was in the wall, it didn't happen. So this pattern was popular on export porcelain in opaque enamels like the Stratford Hall example, as well as translucent enamels more commonly known as amari. This plate was owned by Alexander Spotswood after his tenure as lieutenant governor was complete, and he had moved from Williamsburg to his home Portobello in Orange County, Virginia. So this design has been found archaeologically in Williamsburg and was also owned by the Gore and Cargill families of Massachusetts, and it was here at Drayton Hall. So it was owned in many places in colonial America. And in this detail, we see the two crabs with a Chinese coin between them. And here is an example of what a Chinese coin looked like, an 18th century Chinese coin, to give you a sense of what the design is based on. One crab clutches the coin, the other clutches a reed. So a single crab is symbolic of achieving success in passing the civil service examination. Two crabs with a reed make a rebus conveying the wish, may you pass high on the civil service examination. And not surprisingly, the coin between them is a symbol of wealth. Also shown on the plate is the peony, known as the king of flowers, and widely used to symbolize holding high rank. So all of that taken together, this dish becomes symbolic of well wishes that once you pass your exam, you will become a high-ranking government official who will be assured a very good income. It's a lot for one plate to stand for. But it's certainly more than, oh, look, a pretty dish, which is what most of us would say. And this deeper reference would have been known immediately to the Chinese, and of course not known to Thomas Lee, Alexander Spotswood, John Drayton, or anyone else in colonial America. In a similar vein are these fragments, which were excavated in Williamsburg this summer. And I mean similar, not that they were related visually, but that they held imagery with a great deal of meaning for the Chinese. This image was taken in the field while the fragments were still dirty, so I apologize. But the place where they were found is on the campus of the College of William and Mary at the site next to the 18th century Wren building. At this point, the feature where this teacup was found appears to have been a saw pit used in the reconstruction of the Wren building in the 17-teens. The deep pit was filled in shortly thereafter, and a number of late 17th and early 18th century ceramics have been found in it, including this circa 1700 teacup. Another example of this pattern was found in the 1930s in Williamsburg. The design depicts the 8 trigrams together with the yin and yang symbol. The trigrams are traditional symbols of divination that were recorded in the I Ching, or Book of Changes. Each grouping of broken and unbroken lines represents an element in nature. For example, the group on the top of this image is symbolic of mountain, and the group on the bottom references water. Trigrams are often shown together with the yin and yang symbol, illustrating the cosmic duality of light and dark, male and female. Essentially, the images on this cup represent the cosmology of Taoism. Trigrams first appear on Chinese art during the Han Dynasty, but are not generally found on ceramics until the Yuan Dynasty, which is about the 13th and 14th centuries. I am sure the scholars at William and Mary were learning about philosophy during the early 18th century, but I doubt they were spending much time on the I Ching. I mean, maybe I'm wrong, but... As previously stated, the vast majority of porcelains recovered were teacups or wine cups that were likely used for the drinking of tea, coffee, or chocolate. Like the previous example, many of them have reshaped what we thought we knew about export porcelain in the colonies. This cup was recovered from the site that we now know as the Chiswell Bucktrout House on Francis Street in Williamsburg. At the time that this cup was in use, the property was owned by James Bray. Prior to 1699, Williamsburg was known as Middle Plantation. Bray and his family were among the early residents there. They arrived from England in 1657 and purchased 290 acres in Middle Plantation, including the construction of a home near where this cup was excavated. Bray rose to prominence in the community and served as a member of the House of Burgesses. Unfortunately, he took part in a rebellion led by Nathaniel Bacon against Governor Berkeley in 1676, and Bray and his wife managed to escape execution, but he was removed from the House of Burgesses and most of his property confiscated. So this cup is a fairly hastily decorated example and not necessarily of great interest if it weren't for the mark on it, which you see here on the bottom. Most Chinese ceramics that come to America are not marked. Marks tended to be destined for the domestic market. So this is a cup that was probably intended to be used for the domestic market. This mark is the only one that I know of in a colonial American context. And the piece dates to about 1662 to 1722. These marks are often the name of the place the piece seems to have been made for, or a representation of a specific person. And they're called hallmarks. This mark translates as Investigate Antiquity Hall. The mark indicates that the cup was made to honor a particular person, Guo Jianyang, a Chinese scholar official who was a native of Jiaxin, located between Shanghai and Hangzhou. The mark has no meaning to a Western audience. As I said, very unusual to have it in an American context, colonial American context. And here's another example of an early 18th century cup from the same site. Ornamented on the exterior with a combination of translucent enamels, this tea or wine cup is covered with a design typically referred to as egg and spinach. Very descriptive. The decoration is not frequently found on teawares and rarely uncovered archaeologically in an American context, although we may have one piece here at Drayton Hall. We found it today. I don't know, I'm not 100% sure, but it seems like that's the closest thing that it matches. So. And here's the bottom of that piece. It too is marked. And this is one of the marks indicating the 8 precious things. Each of these is a symbol of good fortune, and the one on our cup is the lozenge mark. So prior to his fall from grace, James Bray was clearly a very wealthy man. It is clear from the archaeological evidence that he and his family left behind that they were of a higher status than most of the residents of the region during the 17th century. This fragment is from a rosewater sprinkler. That's what that's. It's a form adapted from metal examples used in India or Persia. Rosewater was a popular fragrance used to scent interiors in the Middle East and Southeast Asia. And this is the only fragment that I know of that's been found in a colonial American context. And here are some other examples. They were typically fitted with pierced silver caps. In Europe, they were grouped together and displayed on furniture or elaborate wall brackets, and these vessels were more likely serving as decorative rather than utilitarian wares in the European and colonial context. So this is how they would have been used in Persia or the Middle East. Here, they didn't have the silver caps added to them because they were just sitting on a shelf as a vase, essentially. The same site that yielded these wonderful 17th century pieces also contained a number of examples of 18th century porcelain, including this plate. By the time this object was deposited, a new house had been built, one that still stands today. This house was built around 1750 and was owned by Colonel John Chiswell. Chiswell was a member of the House of Burgesses from Hanover County, Virginia. Like most of the men we have already talked about, Robert Beverly, Thomas Lee, John Custis, and John Randolph, Chiswell owned land in his home county and a home in the capital city of Williamsburg. He also owned lead mines, and interestingly, when he was visiting those mines in 1766, he quarreled with a merchant, Robert Rutledge, and called him a fugitive rebel, a villain who came to Virginia to cheat and defraud men of their property, and a Presbyterian fellow. He then proceeded to kill Rutledge in front of a crowd, stabbed him, and was arrested. He was later transported to Williamsburg to stand trial, and while out on bail, died suddenly in his house, likely by his own hand. So interesting, but not why I bring him up. I just had to tell you that story. I bring him up because of the plates that were found at the site. The plate decorated and dish decorated with this pattern were excavated from his house site. This design, depicting a pineapple and nutmeg and clove sprigs, were taken from Pierre Paume's A Complete History of Drugs, published in London in 1712. Rarely represented on Chinese export porcelain, few examples of botanical patterns survive. In 1769, the Dutch East India Company ordered 984 flat plates and 399 soup plates with the pineapple, which may have been this pattern. Saucers from a tea service thus decorated were recovered from the wreck of a British East India ship, the Griffin, returning from China laden with tea, spices, and porcelain. The ship sank off the coast of the Philippines in 1761. And 3 plates from a dinner service of identical design to the ones found at Chiswell were excavated from a Philadelphia privy associated with an early house at Gray's Alley. The privy's 1750 closure indicates that the plates were deposited prior to that date, more than 10 years before the Griffin shipwreck. At that time, the house was occupied by William and Patience Annis. He was a sea captain who traveled regularly around the Atlantic world. Annis could have purchased the plates on a trip to England. Almost all archaeologically recovered Chinese porcelain falls into one of 2 categories, either teacups and saucers or plates and flat dishes. Hollowware forms associated with dining or other portions of tea and coffee service are much less common. However, there are some, including this wonderful patty pan recovered from the Williamsburg site that we've been discussing, the home of Colonel John Chiswell. Patty pans were a common form in use during the 18th century, and we find quite a few of them in excavations. They were one of the few pieces that was used both for cooking and then for serving. So you would have had like potted meat or other types of things put in them. They would have been warmed near the stove in close proximity to coals, but not directly on them, and then brought to the table. It is clear from written and archaeological records that wealthy men owned quite a bit of Chinese porcelain. However, while it is less well documented, we do know that tradesmen owned porcelain, and specifically they tended to have teawares, punch bowls, and some plates or dishes. In a survey of Virginia probate inventories taken between 1750 and 1770, I found extensive evidence of blacksmiths, tanners, bookbinders, shoemakers, and a number of other tradesmen, all listed as owning at least 1 or 2 pieces of Chinese porcelain. Included in this list of tradesmen is William Daring, dancing master and portrait painter. Daring moved to Williamsburg from Philadelphia in 1737, where he advertised that he was available to teach dancing according to the newest French manner on Fridays and Saturdays at his home on Palace Green. Daring was not the most accomplished artist, but he did paint a number of portraits of Southern colonists, including Anne Bird Carter. The Carters lived near Daring on Palace Green. While Daring was accepted by the planter class, he was essentially a tradesman attempting to live beyond his means. He found himself in financial trouble fairly soon after his arrival in Virginia. In 1744, he mortgaged his home and all of its contents. The mortgage listed 2-gallon china bowl, a 2-gallon china bowl, 1-gallon ditto, 2 smaller ditto, and a dozen china plates. Never able to get out from under this burden, Daring left Virginia in 1749, and he moved here to Charleston. It is unclear if he prospered here, but it would have been a good location for him since, as this audience well knows, Charleston was easily the most wealthy city in the South at the time. In fact, a great deal of elaborate Chinese export porcelain made its way to Charleston and the surrounding plantations. Drayton Hall is a great illustration of this phenomenon. As you may know, the home built by John Drayton is the second home built on the site. At least the second home. There might be 3, who knows? Prior to that, planter and political figure Francis Young lived there in his home on the Ashley River. Young was involved in politics here in South Carolina, and he went to England several times on the colony's business. Both his travels and his wealth gave him access to luxury goods like this beaker, one of 3 excavated from the site, and you saw an example of it out in the lobby. So these are wonderful beakers. Circa 1720, fabulous things. Young also owned a teacup represented by these sherds decorated at the top, decorated with the same Sanskrit pattern as the pair recovered from the governor's palace. John Drayton completed Drayton Hall around 1752. He was a man of great wealth and status, as indicated by his home, as well as his porcelain. He owned a great, vast variety of Chinese porcelain, and it's so much fun. So many different patterns. This teacup and saucer date to the earliest years of John Drayton's occupation, actually probably before his occupation of the site. These probably date to his first marriage. Is that what we decided? Yeah. And this type of decoration is rarely found archaeologically in America. These examples were excavated along with 3 matching teacups, saucers, and a waste bowl, suggesting that they were part of a matching set. Seriously, huge deal, matching set. These are early, these are like 1735-ish. And they're matching. Nobody shopped in matching sets in that time, except John Drayton and a few others. So this is a really big deal. I swear there's gonna be a teapot out there. Yes. Unlike the other Drayton Hall pieces that we have seen, these next few pieces are all above ground survivals, yay. This plate is part of a large group that was purchased by John Drayton around 1750. And here we have a wonderful tea set, which was made in China, but then later gilded in England. The English gilding is of high quality, but does not directly relate to the cobalt decoration that was already on the pieces, which is very common. This was not uncommon as the gilding was intended to impress and make mundane porcelains more fashionable. Each of these pieces bears the mark of the gilder who decorated them on the underside. So if you have a piece of Chinese porcelain which has a gilding mark on the bottom, then it had to have been gilded in a place other than China, because the Chinese never marked with a gilder's mark. And I just love that they were like, well, we're just gonna tart this up a bit, and we don't really care. We don't really care if the gilding matches the decoration at all, because it's gonna be shiny and pretty, so what does it matter? We'll just swap some of this over here and some over here. And this is one of just four garnitures that was owned by the Drayton family that we know of. It was likely acquired during the refurnishing of the house that occurred in the 1780s. And it is a wonderful garniture. It's fabulous. And for those of you that don't know, garniture sets were always in 3, 5, or 7 vases, and they were a European creation. They were assembled once they reached the European docks. They did not leave China as garnitures. They became garnitures when they got to Europe. They were just vases in China. The reality is that while many people owned at least some Chinese porcelain, tradesmen, widows, merchants, and the wealthy, most of what we know about today are those things that were associated with the wealthy landowners. These are the sites that have been explored in great depth. But combined with the broader archaeological record and advertisements, it becomes clear that there was a lot of porcelain in the colonial South, and it was far more varied than most of us have understood. For example, there are pieces of Celadon glazed porcelain recovered from the site of the apothecary shop in Williamsburg, as well as a shard from Jamestown Island. You can see that the bowl shard recovered from Williamsburg, which is on the left-hand side, is decorated with incised lines. And here we have an example of a vase that's in the Ringling Museum's collection, ornamented with that same technique. The incised lines fill with more glaze than the surrounding area, creating subtle decoration. I never thought we'd find Celadon in an 18th century American context, but sure enough. And here we have a rare Huaxi teapot that was excavated from the Drummond site near Williamsburg. This is one of the nicest pieces of blue and white porcelain I've seen recovered from a colonial American context. Huaxi porcelain is often described as Chinese soft-paste porcelain, but in reality it is normal hard-paste porcelain that has been covered with a thin slip of pure kaolin clay, thus rendering the surface much easier to paint. Wares of this type were at least twice as expensive as normal blue and white porcelain and are not common among export wares. And the Drummond site is interesting because I mentioned James Bray, and he was part of Bacon's rebellion, and he lived. Drummond was also part of that rebellion, and he did not. And he was executed, and his widow goes to England and appeals to the crown and says, "You've seized my property, you've killed my husband, I've lost everything," and they compensate her. She didn't own the property. She rented it. And she went to England and claimed that she owned it. And they gave her a lot of money, and then she went shopping. And she came back, and the best stuff has come out of the ground there. Amazing stuff. The best salt glazed stoneware you've ever seen. She was a smart lady. Another unusual example is this small fragment, which comes from the center of a saucer dish decorated with the shoe character surrounded by bats, or symbols of good luck. The word for bat in Chinese sounds identical to the word for good fortune. Shu is the Chinese character for longevity, which is one of the 5 blessings: longevity, wealth, health, love of virtue, and a peaceful death. The Shu symbol appears on every conceivable decorative art in China, and this fragment was recovered from Weatherburn's Tavern. Chinese porcelain was purchased at auction. It had good resale value. It was acquired through factors. It was sold in shops. It was passed down, and it was thrown away. All of these actions help us to understand the past and the porcelain that was owned and used in a particular place during a particular time. And porcelain was also stolen. And I will leave you today with this advertisement from the Virginia Gazette, placed on November 20th, 1769, that tells the story of theft. Whereas my wife, Suzanne Greer, clandestinely absconded from my house in Dumfries on Monday, the 30th of October last, carrying with her by water some of my most valuable effects and household furniture, viz. 2 Negro children, Rachel, a girl of 5 years old, Jess, a boy of 3, and a white boy, her son, of 14 years old, of a sickly complexion, with 1 dozen of silver spoons, a silver ladle, 1 dozen of silver teaspoons marked RG, 2 trunks, 2 tables, a little chest, some chinaware, a gun, a watch, 2 beds, and kitchen furniture, too tedious to relate. I am informed she went for Norfolk and is supposed to have gone off with 1 Anthony Richards. He is about 6 feet high, 30 years of age, pock-pitted, large-mouthed black hair. He has had a good education and talks fluently. He carried off my horse with him and several valuable books, went off about the same time she did, and was seen going down the country towards Norfolk. Any person, therefore, who will apprehend them so as I shall recover my effects shall have 10 pounds reward. And I hereby forewarn all persons whatever not to give her credit on my account, as I will not pay any of her debts. I likewise forewarn all masters of vessels from carrying them out of this colony. Robert Greer. Poor guy. He lost his porcelain and his wife and his horse all in the same day. And apparently a child that wasn't his, but pale complexion, anyway. So to paraphrase the song lyrics, China and sometimes life gets broken and it will never be the same. And perhaps that is a good thing, because so many of the objects we talked about today would not be known to us without their having been broken, disposed of, and excavated. They become something different, and in so doing have been rediscovered to share their stories with us. Thank you.
All right, well, thanks to Suzanne for wonderful insight into porcelain and colonial America, and want to applaud you for your research and your collaboration with Drayton Hall, which is really continuing to shed new light on Drayton Hall, how it appeared, how it was used in the 18th century, and really fleshing out our understanding of Drayton Hall as one of the most significant elite plantations in colonial America. So thank you. Are there any questions for Suzanne? Maxwell.
You know, I didn't think to look to see if there's a follow-up advertisement saying, I got back the stuff I wanted and I let her go. I don't know.
When did teacups come to have handles?
Ah, yes, one of the long-standing problems. So teacups, handles or no handles. Basically, through the entire 18th century, they have handleless and handled teacups. They coexist, they live together, and and into the 19th century even. They advertised frequently handles with cups and cups with handles and cups without handles. So the earliest ones I know probably date to the early part of the 18th century because they're basically adapting a wine cup form to be a teacup, and then the Chinese take off with that. But yeah, well, no, there are handled cups in the end of the 17th century too. So I think they kind of lived together happily.